Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, today we will be taking Sutta number 7 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is called the Vatthupama Sutta, the discourse on the simile of the cloth. Okay, this sutta is particularly important because of its mention of what are called the 16 upakilesa, or 16 mental defilements. Okay, this sutta begins with the Buddha drawing a simile. He says, okay, we're in paragraph 2, suppose a cloth were defiled and stained, and a dyer dipped it in some dye, could be either blue, yellow, red, or carmine. Then the cloth would look poorly dyed, and it would take the color badly, so it would come out impure. So why is that? Because of the impurity of the cloth. And so the Buddha says, when the mind is defiled, then an unhappy or a bad destination may be expected. And what's meant by a bad destination or an unhappy destination is an unhappy realm of rebirth. That is the rebirth in one of the 3 lower realms of existence, in either the hell realms, the animal realm, or the realm of the unhappy spirits. And this is because the mental defilements are usually the motivations for unwholesome karma, and it's unwholesome karma that, when it's created, accumulated, and becomes strong enough, then brings rebirth into the unhappy destinations. Okay, then on the counterpart to this, suppose a cloth were pure and bright, and the dyer dipped it in some dye, some kind of dye, again blue, yellow, red, or carmine. Then when the cloth is taken out, it would be well dyed and pure in color. And why is that? Because the cloth is pure, because the cloth has been thoroughly cleansed. And so too, when the mind is undefiled, a happy destination can be expected. Usually in mundane terms, the happy destination or the good destination means a good realm of rebirth. That is, rebirth as a human being under fortunate circumstances, or rebirth in one of the celestial realms. But here I think the word happy destination or fortunate destination has a broader meaning. It means not simply a fortunate realm of rebirth, but it also includes those attainments that lie beyond the realms of rebirth. That is, it could also include the attainment of the path, realization of the paths and fruits, or in other words, the attainment of nibbana. Okay, so the simile of the cloth is the way in which the Buddha opens the sutta. And now he's going to take off from that simile of the cloth by explaining how the mind is defiled, and then how the mind is cleansed. And he does this by mentioning the factors that are called, in this translation is called the imperfections that defile the mind. But actually the Pali word, as you find on the handout, is chitas upakilesa. Upakilesa comes from the word, it's chitta, which means mind, and then we have the word kilesa, which normally means defilement. And when we have the prefix upa, sometimes upa gives a sense of minor. So these might be called the minor defilements. The major defilements would simply be greed, hatred, and delusion. And then the different branches of greed, hatred, and delusion are the upakilesas, different combinations of greed, hatred, and delusion. So we might say different chemical compounds of these basic elements. Okay, so now the Buddha, after raising the question, what are these defilements of the mind? Now he's going to enumerate them. And they come down as 16 factors. The first is given as covetousness and unrighteous greed. Here was the word is translated as covetousness. If you look in the table, we have abhijja, and then that's coupled with visama lobha. And some of the terms that are come in this list of 16 factors are a little bit obscure in the Pali. It's difficult to determine just from the sutta itself what exactly is meant by these terms. Perhaps they would have been, the words would have been known, easily understood amongst the Buddha's contemporaries, just as we can understand words like resentment, obstinacy, insolence, and so on. But over time, it seemed, within the Buddhist community, as Buddhism spread to other countries, the exact meaning of these words became obscured. And so, some of the commentarial texts attempt to give more precise definitions of these words. And so to understand them, I took selections from two other texts. One is called the Vibhanga. This is the book of analysis. It's the second book in the Pali Abhidhamma Pitaka. And it has one chapter towards the end of the Vibhanga, which gives detailed analysis of all the different mental defilements with sometimes long definitions of them. The other source that I drew upon is the commentary to the Majjhima Nikaya. This is called the Papancha Sutta. Okay, and so I indicate with regard to each of these defilements what is the source of the definition. So if you look at the page, the paper I gave out, finding what is the meaning here of abhijja, translated as covetousness. So it explains, and what is the difference, the distinction between covetousness and unrighteous greed? They are joined together to form a compound, but there seems to be a subtle distinction in the exact meaning of these two terms. Okay, and so the Papancha Sutta says, covetousness is desire for attachment to one's own belongings. Actually, that's a little bit contradictory to the exact meaning of the English word covetousness, right? Which normally means desiring the possessions of others. So maybe we could render abhijja, not by covetousness, but maybe put it simply, attachment. Okay, and then unrighteous greed is desire for and attachment to the belongings of others. Okay, so that's one way of drawing the distinction. But the commentary draws from, there must have been a number of ancient commentators who gave their own opinions. And so we have several ways of drawing the distinction. Another text says covetousness is attachment to an object that is suitable and has been obtained. In other words, there's an object that one is permitted to obtain. It's legal, one is perfectly entitled to it. But if one has intense attachment to it, then that is what is called a bija. For example, I have this recorder. It was given to me as a gift, so legally it's mine. But if I come into my room and I find it's not in the place where I put it, and I see that the window has been broken open, and I see mud steps on the carpet, indicating that a thief has come and stolen it while I was gone, as though it were the most precious thing that he could take. Then I become angry and upset because I had attachment to what legally and properly belonged to me. Okay, so that's covetousness, or abhijja is an attachment to something one has obtained that one is entitled to possess. Whereas unrighteous greed is attachment, or we say it's a craving for an object that is unsuitable, not allowable, and has not been obtained. Like, I'm not satisfied with this audio recorder, I look at this nice video recorder belonging to Chuang Monastery, and I start thinking, maybe when they lock it up in the storeroom at the night, I'll come tiptoeing up here at midnight, break into the storeroom and take it. Okay, so that's Visamaloma, unrighteous greed. But then there was one elder commentator who said there is no greed that is not unrighteous, and therefore he says greed itself is covetousness in the sense of longing, and it's also unrighteous in the sense of being contrary to what is right. And so in the opinion of this elder, covetousness and unrighteous greed are actually the same thing, it's just the terms that are different. I'm not sure if I would agree with that. It seems to me that there's some distinction intended. And also I think it's important here that the text uses the expression visamaloma, which means unrighteous greed. So it seems abhijja is just greed in general, maybe intense or strong greed. And then visamaloma is unrighteous or greed that's illicit or illegal. Greed directed to an object to which one is not entitled. Okay, so you could see anyway that there was no, even in ancient times, there was no unanimity of opinion about the exact meaning of these terms. Okay, the second defilement is ill will. Here, the word given is, in Pali, it's vyapada. This is also mentioned as the second of the 5 hindrances, and it's also the second of the 3 types of unwholesome thought. Then the commentary mentions here, it refers to another sutta which speaks about 9 cases of aversion or resentment. These come in the Anguttara Nikaya. Let's see if I can remember them. I didn't review this. Okay, somebody does what is anyway, maybe we don't have to go through all 9 of them. But if somebody does what is displeasing, disagreeable to me, aversion or resentment can arise. If somebody does what is disagreeable to somebody who is dear and beloved to myself, then aversion and ill will can arise. If somebody does something which is pleasant and agreeable to a person that I dislike, then again a feeling of ill will arise towards that person. So this is ill will. And then closely related to that is anger. This is number 3, koda. It seems ill will and anger are closely connected, but ill will seems to be more of a quiet, persistent type of aversion, a kind of continuous dislike for somebody and wishing harm for that person. Whereas anger is a feeling, an emotion which arises suddenly, and it can be directed towards either people or to circumstances or conditions. So if I want to go out, take a walk, say, or I have a plan to go make a trip, an outdoor trip on a day, and then it's pouring that day, I get angry, not at any person, but at the weather. I remember when I was a young boy, the baseball season started, and I was so looking forward on the Saturday to starting the baseball season. And that day, it rained, and I got so angry that I took my fist and I banged the window, and I broke the glass of the window. As if breaking the glass is going to stop the rain. Okay, so this is anger, and then the Vibhanga gives a whole string of synonyms. Anger, being angry, angriness. Sometimes it's difficult to find suitable English words for these strings of Pali words. Hatred, hating, hatefulness, irritation, irritability, irascibility, opposition, resistance, displeasure of mind. If this doesn't make anger clear to you, then I don't know what will. Okay, then we come to another word which belongs to the same family. In this edition of the Majjhima Nikaya, it's translated as resentment, but I think at a later time I came to prefer another rendering, which is malice. The Pali word is upanaha, and the Vibhanga explains, Vibhanga and the Papancha Sutta both explain in a very similar way. Okay, first there arises anger, but when that anger is directed towards a person and it persists it arises again and again to the point where it completely overpowers the mind, then it turns into malice. It seems it's a stronger type of ill will. Ill will, perhaps, is just dislike for a person. But upanaha is that dislike which takes the form of wishing for that person to meet with some kind of harm and misery. Or it's a strong antagonism towards another person. Okay, the next word again belongs to the same family. You see from 2, starting with number 2, continuing to 3, 4, 5, 6, even 6, even to some extent 7 and 8, all of these mental states are in some way connected with the unwholesome root of hatred. In Pali, dosa. So this is called contempt. And this means according to the Vipancha Sutta, it's disregard of favors done towards oneself. So it takes first the example of a person from lay life. So somebody is poor, maybe born into unhappy circumstances. Then somebody, another person, out of compassion, helps the poor fellow, maybe gives him the opportunity for an education, gives him some kind of vocational training, sets him up in a good job, maybe has him married into a well-to-do family. And then later that person, after he's worked his way up the employment ladder, he looks back at that person who benefited him and then thinks, what did that fellow do for me? I accomplished this all by myself. And then he despises the person who helped him. Okay, so this is the case, that's the case of a layperson. Then the case of a monk, it's somewhat parallel. We have a monk who initially is just maybe a young novice from a peasant family. He gets ordained. Then his teachers give him instruction. He might be bright, intelligent, so he rises up amongst his peers. Till later he becomes well-known, famous, highly respected. And he looks back at the elders who gave him his early instructions and thinks, how did they help me? I accomplished this all by myself. And thus he regards them with contempt. Okay, the next defilement was a little bit obscure, and I'm not sure that I captured the exact nuance of it. I used the rendering. Then Nyanamouli had actually originally used domineering, or a domineering attitude. But then when I looked at the explanations given in the commentaries, I saw that didn't fit very well. And so then I changed the rendering to insolence. And in this I followed the explanation given in the Majjhima commentary, which says that it's the sense of competitiveness that arises overpowering somebody else. For example, towards a learned person, one thinks, what is the difference between you or me? That is, you compare yourself to others, and even though that other person might be superior to oneself, but you think, I'm just as good as he is, and then one looks down at that person, or one tries to compete with that person, and then one looks insolently at that person. Okay, that's an attempt to understand the meaning. The next two, the meaning is quite clear. One is envy. And so this is explained in the Abhidhamma as the envy that arises towards the gain, honor, respect, esteem, veneration, and reverence shown towards others. I think that that explanation is framed against the background of monastic life, but in mundane life it could be envying even the wealth of others, the possession of others, the position of others, many different objects of envy. But the emotion behind the envy is basically the same. It's a feeling of displeasure or dislike when others receive things or achieve things that one doesn't receive oneself, or that you haven't achieved yourself. And then the other side of envy is miserliness, or stinginess, or meanness. And this is the feeling of not wanting to share one's good fortune with others. And so again, the Abhidhamma text gives the explanation in terms of a monastic situation. That is miserliness regarding dwellings. Like sometimes a monk will have, sometimes he's offered several dwelling places and he wants to keep them all, not allow anybody else to live there. Or towards families, not wanting his own families of supporters to give support to others. Again, not wanting others to achieve gains or to share his gains with others. Not wanting others to receive praise, but not wanting to praise others himself, and not wanting to share his knowledge of Dhamma with others, from fear that others will take that knowledge, use that knowledge, and then advance by gaining that knowledge. Okay, so this is miserliness. Now we come to two defilements, which are again opposite sides of the same coin. One is called Maya, which here means deceit, deceitfulness. And the Abhidhamma gives the explanation. Somebody misbehaves by body, speech, or mind, and then for the purpose of concealing it, he forms the evil wish, may others not find out about this. So this is trying to cover up, to conceal one's misbehavior, and then trying to deceive others about it. So it's explained by such synonyms as deceptiveness, crookedness, craftiness, concealment, and so on. Then the counterpart of this is called satya, which is what is translated as, in the original text, as fraud. In the notes, I use the word craftiness. And then the commentary uses the example of something called a long fish. Perhaps this could be an eel, I'm not sure. But it said that this long fish, it shows its tail to the fish and its head to snakes, in order to make both of them think, you see, I'm just like you are. So when the fish see the long tail, they'll think, he's a fish. And when the snake see his head, they'll think he's a snake. And so the trickster is somebody who shows himself to others in a deceptive way, and he says to them, I'll be your companion, your friend, your benefactor, I'll never desert you. But really his object is just to get some personal benefits for himself. And so he's crafty or deceptive in relation to others. Okay, the next one is obstinacy. Okay, this is clearly, the meaning of this is quite clear. It means being inflexible, rigid, unyielding, sticking sort of forcefully to one's own opinions, persisting in one's own habits, being unwilling to consider the opinions of others, being unwilling to change one's opinion, to adapt to others, to challenging circumstances. Okay, the next, again, it's a little ambiguous, exactly the meaning of the Pali, but basing on the explanation in the commentary, I rendered it as rivalry. Perhaps it could also be translated presumptuousness. Okay, if we follow the explanation given in the Majjhima commentary, it says that can be of two kinds, unwholesome and wholesome. Okay, then for the unwholesome, so a lay person sees another person dressed up, maybe in beautiful clothing and ornaments, and then he thinks, I'm going to surpass that person. And so the second person dresses up, maybe with more beautiful clothing, more luxurious ornaments, more fashionable clothing than the first person, in order to outdo the other person, to show up the other person, and to stand out himself or herself. And then in the case of a monk who hears that another has learned so much Dhamma or is able to preach so much, then he thinks, I'm going to outdo that person. And so he tries to learn more, to preach longer. Maybe if the other person is able to sit in meditation for 1 hour, the one who's looking over, waiting for the person on his side to get up, to break his legs and to get up, and then thinks, I will sit longer, I'll sit for 2 hours so everybody will admire me. So this is trying to outstrip the other person based on a conceit and a wish to stand out and to be somebody special. Okay, the next three defilements are, we could say, are different modes of conceit. The first is simple conceit, which is, here it's given as explained as elevation of the mind on account of one's social class, maybe one's wealth, one's position, one's education, one's physical beauty, anything, one's intelligence, one's learning, anything that makes one swell up with conceit. That is mana. Then, deriving from that comes number 14, which is called, here is called arrogance. The Pali word is atimana. The prefix ati has the sense of exceeding or excessive. So this is excessive conceit, which takes the form of looking down upon others and despising others, thinking, I'm better than others, and then one looks down at others. So it's arrogance, or we might also call it haughtiness. Okay, then comes number 15. The Pali word is mudda, which often has the literal sense of intoxication. So intoxicating drinks are called majja, wine, whiskey, other kinds of liquors. And so this is the state of mind which is intoxicated. It could be intoxicated with one's social class, one's family background, one's education, one's physical beauty. And the suttas explain this intoxication as being intoxicated when young, one is intoxicated with one's youth. When one is in good health, one is intoxicated with one's health. When one is alive and full of vitality, one is intoxicated with life. Okay, so this is intoxication or vanity. And then the 16th is a very general or broad term, Pali, this is pamada, which in the published translation it's translated negligence. Later I revised this to heedlessness. And the commentary explains that it's letting the mind roam among the objects of sensual pleasures. Maybe that's too narrow a definition. Generally, this word pamada has the sense of not being conscientious, losing one's awareness, one's recognition of the need to uphold, let's say, the precepts in one's conduct, the need to be diligent in one's striving, the need to maintain mindfulness in one's everyday life. And so letting the mind slip into any of the defilements and remain there without being alert enough to pull the mind back and set it on the straight path of righteousness. This would be the meaning of pamada, heedlessness. And maybe most of you have read the Dhammapada, you know, the second chapter in the Dhammapada. Heedlessness is the path to death, and heedfulness is the path to the deathless. And so the Buddha has again and again emphasized the importance of heedfulness in all activities. Okay, so this takes us through the 16 defilements of the mind. If anybody has any questions relating to these, please feel free to ask. Do we have the floating microphone? Ah, there it is in front of you.
Yes, Bhante, should we take any significance from the order in which these are presented?
The way I would look at the order, I seem to see a certain, as I pointed out, a certain organization by way of groups. Okay, first, covetousness and unrighteous greed. This is, of course, it's connecting with the first unwholesome root, which is greed itself. Then from 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, those defilements are in some way almost manifestations or variants on the second unwholesome root, hatred. And then even 7 and 8 arise from hatred, because envy is a feeling of resentment that arises towards the success and good fortune of others. And miserliness, superficially it seems to be connected to greed. And maybe greed is an element in it, a little bit like water is a combination of hydrogen and oxygen. So in miserliness there's greed, but the way miserliness manifests, it manifests as unwillingness to share. And so that unwillingness is a kind of hatred. So we could actually say from 2 to 8, there are different manifestations of hatred. Then the next, there doesn't seem to be anything absolutely fixed in their order, except 9 and 10 are, as I said, two sides of the same coin. 11 and 12, doesn't seem to be a connection between them. 13, 14, 15 are closely related. And then actually 16 also seems to be in this group, in that Madda and Pamada are based upon the same verbal root. You see Madda and Pamada. Pamada is the prefix pa, and then the stem mada, based on the verbal root mud.
And is is there any order in which, like, they're more intractable or difficult to release?
There's a sutta in the Digha Nikaya, in the Anguttara Nikaya. It says, let me see if I can remember it. Greed is less blameworthy, but slower to fade away, whereas hatred is more blameworthy, but quicker to fade away. Maybe that's the opinion of the one who spoke that sutta. Some of us have had trouble with hatred. And delusion is slow. Let's say delusion is very blameworthy and also slow to fade away. But I think as we go on, we're going to see how these defilements get eradicated in different stages. And so some are more persistent than others.
Could you explain the difference between the first minor defilement with the first mental karmic unwholesome conduct?
The first unwholesome what?
The 10 karmic paths. The first one is the first karmic path. Because when we had that sutra, you explained that as longing for others' possessions.
Oh, I see.
So
I see.
then it's exactly the opposite, whether they use the same word.
Oh, this is a good point. Yeah, in the 10 courses of unwholesome karma, the 3 mental courses, we have abhijja. This is translated covetousness. And then that is explained not simply as greed or craving, but in order to become an unwholesome course of karma, it has to take the form of craving for the possessions of others, craving to take possession of the belongings of others. And so actually that could be the intention here. And in that case, we would see visama lobha as a synonym for abhijja. In fact, it's even possible, conceivable, that the original sutta spoken by the Buddha simply used the word abhijja, and then to clarify the meaning, maybe some monk who was explaining it introduced the word visamalopa, which is a rare combination, as a way, or maybe the Buddha himself introduced that word as a way of clarifying the exact nuance of abhijja here. And then it came into the text. So that's a possibility.
Venerable One, did these codes of conduct arise out of the community of the Sangha at the time and the Buddha's observation, or did they come from his experience as he was on the journey to enlightenment after he left the palace?
I would say that that this particular list has just come from his observation of the way the human mind works. They would have been, of course, I mean, monks have them as well. The fact that one gets ordained doesn't mean that the mind is clean, is automatically cleaned of them. And obviously, because the Buddha is explaining them to the monks, so he's explaining how a monk should go about overcoming these defilements of the mind. But they're not something just which is peculiar to members of the Sangha, but everybody has, at least everybody who hasn't reached some stage of enlightenment, has these tendencies in the mind. So this is a kind of a broad schema for incorporating many different defiled mental states as a kind of guideline for training. Okay, I'll just take there's one internet question, then I want to move on. Okay, the question is heedfulness similar to mindfulness? I would say that mindfulness is part of heedfulness, but they're not exactly synonyms. I would say that heedfulness involves mindfulness. It involves some sense of what we call in Pali hiri-ottappa. Hiri would be the sense, sometimes it's translated the sense of shame, maybe better the sense of self-respect. And ottappa is the fear of the consequences of wrongdoing. And then it also involves energy or effort. That is making the effort to pull the mind back when the mind is wandering off into the pasture of unwholesome thoughts, or the temptation to act in unwholesome ways. Okay, now I want to move on to the next section in the sutta. Here, this is a very concise section. The text says, knowing that covetousness and unrighteous greed is a defilement of the mind, a bhikkhu, a monk, abandons it. Knowing that ill will and so forth, up to negligence, is a defilement of the mind, a monk abandons it. Okay, now we have here a very important word in the whole pattern of the Buddha's teaching. A word which comprises or compresses within itself the whole field of Buddhist training. This is the verb abandon, where we take the noun form abandoning, abandonment. In Pali, it's pahana. I can't seem to abandon my... now this word abandoning covers, we say, the full range of the practice of the Buddhist path. And so the texts sometimes make a distinction of 3 types of abandoning. So one type is called, we call it abandoning by factor substitution, or abandoning in a particular respect. First, I'll just mention what all 3 are, then I'll explain them. The second is abandoning by suppression, and the third is abandoning by eradication. Okay, now abandoning by in a particular respect, or abandoning by factor substitution, this is the way one overcomes a particular defilement by developing a quality that's exactly opposed to that defilement. And so one could use a particular type of reflection as an antidote to a particular defilement of the mind.